Alright, so you want to make more power and get your car to go faster. Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can go with a standard intake, exhaust, and a tune. You can go to higher octane fuels or even E85. But if you want to make those big boy gains and take your build to the next level, then you're probably looking at forced induction, which means you're going with either a supercharger or a turbocharger. But which one is better, and which one should you choose for your build? Let's talk about it. If you want to make big power numbers and escalate your build above all your boys with the standard mods, exhausts, and whatnot, then you're going to want to make some boost. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Sean, and today we are talking about forced induction, and specifically how these systems work and which one you should choose for your project. But before we dive right in, make sure you hit that like button down below. It really helps to grow the channel. It's a brand new year and we've got some big goals for 2022, so if you're new around here, make sure to hit that subscribe button as well. Now, let's get into it. Everybody knows about the whine of a supercharger and the classic compressor surge of a turbo, but not everybody knows exactly what the difference is between the two. So let's first talk about their similarities and then we'll talk about how they're different. So in order to understand boost, we first have to know how the standard 4-stroke engine works. I've already done a whole video on this, so if you want to see the full explanation, you can check that out right here. A typical 4-stroke engine consists of exactly that, 4 different strokes: intake, compression, ignition, and exhaust. In order for ignition to occur, the mixture of air and fuel has to be at just the right proportion. This is called your air-fuel ratio, or AFR for short. With a specified amount of fuel combustion, you can make a certain amount of power. Now, if you want to make more power, you're going to need more fuel. But remember what we just said about the air-fuel ratio. If you want to add more fuel, you need to add more oxygen in order to keep that ratio correct and to keep your engine running properly. If you increase your injector size and start dumping fuel into the engine without adding any extra air, then this is considered running rich. If you add more air but not enough fuel, then your engine is running lean. Being in either of these conditions is not necessarily healthy for your engine. So if you want more fuel so you can make more power, then how do you add more air into the engine? Well, that is where forced induction comes in. Forced induction is the process of adding air that is pressurized above standard atmospheric levels. Both superchargers and turbochargers can compress air before it goes into your intake. This means that the air going into your engine is more dense and has more oxygen molecules that can be reacted with a greater amount of fuel. More fuel plus more air equals more power, baby! Superchargers and turbochargers pressurize air in a couple of different ways, but the concept is mainly the same. Bring air into the system through some sort of filter, and then pressurize that air by increasing its velocity. Some systems may have an intercooler to help lower the temperature of the air, therefore increasing the density of it even further. So now we know the basics of what these systems do, but let's break down how they work and how they differ from each other. Let's start off with turbochargers. In its simplest form, a turbo uses the force from exhaust gas to spin an impeller wheel. The rotation of that wheel then increases the velocity of the air intake, pressurizing it into the engine. A turbo is comprised of 3 main parts: the turbine, the impeller wheel, and the compressor. Typically, the turbo is split into 2 halves, the hot side and the cold side. As the exhaust leaves the engine, a specially designed exhaust manifold, aka the header, feeds the exhaust gas to the turbo, and this is considered the hot side. The impeller consists of 2 different wheels connected by a shaft. The wheel on one side of the impeller resides on the hot side, and the other on the cold side. The compressor is essentially the front of the turbo, as this is where the air comes into the system. As the impeller shaft is spun up to over 100,000 RPM, the wheel on the compressor side speeds up and pressurizes the air through the intake. Now, there are many different sizes of turbos, and there's a ton of ways that you can spec the size of your turbo to fit your application. If you want the boost to come in hard and fast in the mid-range and you're not really concerned with peak top-end power, then you would choose a turbo with a smaller turbine, compressor, and impeller wheel. If you're only concerned with top-end power and you don't really need a fast spool-up, like in the case of drag racing where you're pretty much always at redline and full boost, then you want the biggest turbo you can reasonably fit. Now let's move on to superchargers. There's a few different types of superchargers, but they all get their power from the same source. Superchargers, in one form or another, are all driven by a belt on the front of the engine. Many superchargers have a pulley that actually aligns with all of your other belt-driven accessories, such as your water pump, your alternator, or your power steering pump. Typically, this means that you are lengthening the distance the belt has to travel, and therefore you'll need a longer belt to accommodate for this. but most supercharger kits will come with a new one to fit the specific setup. In the case of dynamic compressors, also commonly known as centrifugal superchargers, they often get mistaken for turbos because the compressor housing somewhat resembles that of a turbo. A belt-driven pulley on the backside of the supercharger is connected to a shaft and then to an impeller wheel. This impeller wheel and the compressor housing function very similarly to that of the compressor on a turbo. The air is brought in through a filter, and then the impeller wheel increases the velocity of the air, which in turn increases the pressure going to the intake. Because of the fact that the impeller wheel speed is determined directly by the RPM of the engine, the boost will increase very linearly all the way to redline. This makes centrifugal superchargers incredibly predictable and a very common choice for daily drivers who want to make more power everywhere under the curve. And finally, we get to the positive displacement type superchargers. Similar to the centrifugal type, they get their power from the connection to the belt on the front of the engine. However, PD superchargers work totally differently and make their boost in a completely different manner. These superchargers displace a constant volume of air no matter the RPM, and they do this with a pair of rotors. This means that if the engine is running at, say, 2500 RPM and you mash the throttle wide open, you'll have full boost pressure immediately. Now, there's two PD superchargers that are most common for automotive use. You've got Roots style superchargers like the old school muscle cars with the big blower towering out the front of the hood, and then you've also got twin screw superchargers. They both consist of two spinning rotors that pull a specified volume of air and discharge it directly into the engine. However, a Roots blower has two identical rotors, while the twin screw has a male and a female rotor, oftentimes with a different number of lobes. On a Roots blower, the air comes into the system and then travels around the outside of the rotors before going into the engine, versus a twin screw where the air comes in and is actually compressed in between the male and female rotors. But it's not all sunshines and rainbows though. Although turbos and superchargers will show significant power gains, there are some downsides to each when considering which is best for your build. Take turbos, for example. Trying to figure out which type and which size turbo will fit your needs is no easy task. You've got to decide what size turbo and compressor wheel you want. This typically scales pretty well with the size of your engine, but for fully built bottom-end applications, you may be able to oversize based on the strength of your internal components. Then you've got the turbine housing size to choose. Pick one that's too small and you'll be choking the engine by limiting how much of the exhaust gas can escape. Pick one that's too big and you can run into some issues developing boost at lower RPMs. And that leads us right into the next big downside of turbos, which is boost lag. Now you've probably heard of this before. You see a big turbo Supra racing a Ferrari on the interstate, and when they take off, the Supra just kind of sits there for a second while it's trying to develop that boost. But once it's got boost, the thing just takes off like a rocket. If your turbo is too small, then you'll have a lot of power and torque at first, but then halfway through the RPMs, the power starts to fall off because the exhaust is struggling to spin that tiny impeller wheel. On the other hand, if you size your turbo too big, then you'll have no power down low, but you'll have max power for the last 1000 RPMs or so. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on how to properly size your turbo, but Donut Media did a video on this a while back, so if you want to see that, I'll leave a link down in the description. Now, another knock on the turbo's resume is how much heat is generated when you go to a turbo setup. Because the exhaust gas from the engine is routed directly to the turbo, this exposes a lot more of the engine bay to that heat input. This can cause heat sink, which is when excess heat from your turbo starts to affect other parts of your engine, such as oil and coolant temps. Now, this means that you may end up having to upgrade your radiator to maintain those coolant temps, or potentially pick up an aftermarket oil cooler. It's not the end of the world, but it's just another thing to consider when picking your form of forced induction. So now let's turn our crosshairs to superchargers. Superchargers don't normally have the same complexity when it comes to picking out options for your car, but that also means that there may not be quite as much fine-tuning or customization for the setup. Most manufacturers will put together an entire kit with the blower that is made for your specific vehicle. Superchargers don't normally introduce the same heat issues that turbos do, but that doesn't mean that superchargers are perfect. Because of the fact that all superchargers in one form or another are driven by a belt that runs off of the crankshaft, and that it takes some energy for the crankshaft to spin the pulley of the supercharger, your blower is actually stealing energy from your engine. That's right, your blower is stealing power from your engine to make power for your engine. This is one of the reasons that a lot of old heads say that turbos are better than superchargers. It's the old adage of using the exhaust gases gives the turbo free horsepower, while a supercharger has to steal power to make power. It's not necessarily a huge deal breaker, but it's yet another thing to consider when it comes to choosing what's right for your build. Alright, we've got all this information out on the table, and now we have to decide which option is the best one to go with. On the one hand, you've got turbochargers. A lot of spec customization, but at the same time, if you mess that up, then your car won't respond the way you want it to. Turbos can be spec'd to have a wide power band and great throttle response, but they also generate a lot of heat which needs to be handled appropriately. They develop free horsepower, but that's not without the potential for boost lag. On the other hand, you've got superchargers. Many different types of blowers to choose from, but not quite the same fine spec customization of a turbo setup. You get instant boost with no lag, but you're extracting power from the engine to develop that boost. So with all of that in mind, here are my personal recommendations. If you're building a street car and you want a nice linear power band with no real spikes in torque or horsepower, then you'll want to go with a centrifugal supercharger such as a Vortec or a Procharger. If you've got a V8 muscle car and you want that nasty download torque, then go with a twin screw supercharger such as a Whipple or a Roush. If you have a street car and you want a nice power band but you also want some sick choo-choo sounds, then go with a mid-size turbo from Garrett, Precision, Borg Warner, or the equivalent. I know mid-size isn't very descriptive, but the recommendation will vary greatly depending on your goals and the size of your engine. If you've got a 2-liter 4-cylinder, then maybe a G28 or a G30 will give you good response and a decent power band. But if you're trying to build a 6-liter LS2, then you're going to need something larger like a G35 or a G40. Not too small, not too big, somewhere in the middle. If you're building a drag car and you're only concerned with top-end power, then go with a turbo setup with the biggest compressor that your engine can manage to spin. For autocross and track day type events, really any of these options will work for you, but you want to choose something that gives you good response all the way through the power band. I'm a fan of turbos myself, so that tends to be my personal recommendation. But when it all boils down to it, there are tons of kits out there for pretty much every single platform, and I'm sure you'll be happy with whatever you think is best for you. After all, it's your money and it's your car, so you build it the way that you want to. Don't let anybody tell you how you should build your project. Do what makes you happy. But that is going to wrap it up for this one, guys. I hope you found this video entertaining and helpful. Leave me a comment down below which of these options you guys would pick for your project car build. If you did find this helpful, then leave it a thumbs up down below and be sure to subscribe. Like I said earlier, we've got big goals for 2022 and I hope that you will be here to join me. Take care, and until next time, build your dreams. Similar to the centrifugal type, these superchargers displace these superchargers displace a